Hi everyone, thanks for joining. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of an issue with sharing my screen. Give me just a second. Right. Brooke, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
I can confirm I can see your screen.
All right, thanks so much. Hi everyone, sorry for 1 minute of the delay. Welcome to this second meeting of season 2 of DOE i2X Forum for Implementation of Reliability Standards for Transmission, or i2X first. We had our first kickoff meeting of season 2 in May, and I'll provide a recap to that as well. Just a reminder that we record the first half of the meeting, so the only presentations part, and then the discussions will not be recorded. If you don't like to be recorded during this part of the meeting, please stay off camera and don't speak. So just the goals and outcomes of i2X first. If you are joining just first time for this meeting, we would like to facilitate understanding and adoption of new and recently updated standards that are relevant to existing and new interconnection of wind, battery, and energy storage plants. So basically inverter-based resources. The forum convenes industry stakeholders to enable practical and more harmonized implementation of the standards. The leadership team will produce a summary of each meeting, similarly to how we've done that during season 1, and we capture all recommended practices, challenges that were raised, and gaps for future work. So just a little bit about leadership team for this project. We have Sandhya from Boston Government Services. He's a contractor of DOE Wind Energy Technologies Office. Robert Reedy from Linda Reed, contractor for DOE Solar Energy Technologies Office. Will Gorman from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Jens Burma, from Electric Power Research Institute, myself, Julia Matevosyan from Energy Systems Integration Group, and Ryan Quinn from Elevate Energy Consulting. So just a recap from the last meeting. So as I mentioned, we had season 2 kickoff meeting. I provided a recap of season 1. I think an important highlight from it is that we had more than 1,000 unique stakeholders that participated in season 1, which ran from May 2024 until April 2025. And we had monthly meetings with which we'll continue this year and half of the next year as well. The key takeaway from season 1 was that there is need for harmonization of inverter-based resource interconnection requirements. We need improved model quality, and this is something we'll be talking about today as well. It's important to coordinate between all of the stakeholders, but also efforts that are going at NERC, FERC, and IEEE. We talked about IEEE 2800 2022 adoption to date and what areas have already adopted. And Jens Burma had a very nice slide showing areas that adopted as well as the way that they have adopted in. So if you missed this meeting, I really encourage you strongly to go and look at the slides. So I think it's an important and very interesting slide informing everybody about adoption efforts to date. So overall, there are 4 adoption methods and detailed reference is where people are adopting clauses of IEEE 2800, but also specifying regional requirements where specificity is needed for 2800. And there is also this hybrid adoption method where people do the same, but also add some additional specifications based on the regional needs. Adoption is easier for new inverter-based resources, and for legacy resources, retrofits are complex and costly. And so basically only software updates, upgrades is something that can be more easily done. Some IEEE requirements will need revision and clarification. We have realized this during work on IEEE 2800.2 draft. So these revisions are particularly necessary where they create challenges for new technologies like grid-forming inverters, and also imply barriers for implementation to existing IBR technologies today. We talked about IEEE 2800.2 draft, which covers recommended practices for conformity assessments of inverter-based resource plants. The draft includes type testing, model validation, commissioning, and post-commissioning steps. It uses should language, not shall, as IEEE 2800 does. And it's not intended to redefine interconnection process, but rather to provide guidance on, recommended practices for conformity assessment with applicable interconnection requirements. IEEE 2800 applies to full IBR plant and not individual device. This means that model validation and testing must occur at the plant level, and inverter level certification. It's impossible to achieve because the requirements are at the point of connection. And secondly, it's not sufficient if the inverter-based resource unit is IEEE 2800 compatible. It's not necessarily ensures that the entire plant is conformant with IEEE 2800. NERC standards, we talked about NERC standards and FERC Order 901 responses to date. So Alex Shadak provided this update on PRC 28, 29, and 30 standards that address IBR monitoring right through and post-event validation. And then we briefly talked about status of NERC Milestone 3 standards that are being worked on this year. And we'll dig deeper into this in the today's session. And then it was also mentioned in IEEE 2800 presentation that Jens delivered that revisions of 2800 are expected in post-2026, and along with additional recommended practices focusing on grid-forming IBRs. And the first edition will focus on battery energy storage, specifically connecting to the bulk power system. So stay tuned for more work on IEEE 2800. Future editions. So just briefly about upcoming meetings. So we are now on meeting 2, talking about Milestone 3 standards. And then in the next couple of meetings, we'll dive deeper into what IBR plant design evaluation with applicable interconnection requirements actually means and what are best practices out there. So we'll spend a couple of meetings on this topic because it's a relatively big topic. So just for today, agenda, we have meeting introductions, which I'm wrapping up right now, and then we'll hear from NERC on progress update on Milestone 3 projects from Sandhya Madan from NERC. Then we'll hear about current state of IBR modeling in North America from Miguel, Cova, Acosta from Vestas. And then legacy IBR plant modeling from Andrew Isaacs from Electranix. The reason why we talk about legacy IBR plant modeling is that NERC standards, once developed and approved, they apply across the board. They may have some exemptions, and in the implementation plan, some exemptions kind of plan going forward. But still overall apply to all IBR plants in reality. So that's why we're bringing this up, how difficult it is to do IBR modeling for legacy plants. And then we'll have, as always, the structured discussion led by me around what are the biggest impediments for accurate IBR plant modeling, and what are the industry needs for workforce development for IBR plant modeling. And with that, please, assume good faith, participate actively in the discussion, be respectful of others, and all that, and let's move on. And I would like to invite Sandhya to present. Please go ahead, Sandhya, share your screen and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you confirm you're able to see my screen?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. So today's presentation is going to be about FERC Order 901 milestones. I'm going to focus on milestone 3, but also wanted to sort of bring the audience together on just standards development and refocus on what exactly is the purpose of NERC standards and some of the history behind FERC Order 901. So just a quick focus on the standards development process. All standards development is conducted according to our standard process manual, which is on the NERC website. And while NERC facilitates the standards development process, the standards are actually developed by the drafting team, which is comprised of members from the utilities, the different regions, sometimes vendors and contractors as well. So also want to specify when we put together reliability standards, we identify who are the responsible entities that the standards applies to, what are the objectives, and how often you need to meet these objectives. The NERC standards will not specify how the objectives are going to be met. So this is a very important distinction, and just wanted to sort of focus on that a little bit. Right, having said that, looking at the big picture for Order 901 summary, milestone 1 was to submit Order 901 work plan submission. Order 2 is to take a look at performance requirements and looking at validation for registered IBRs, in particular data collection. For milestone 3, this is due November of this year. This is related to modeling and data sharing for all IBRs. And next year, once we get the data from IBRs, have the model set up, we will be focusing on what studies are to be run, both planning and operational for IBRs. All right, so just taking a quick look at milestone 2 before we move to the milestone 3. This focused on disturbance monitoring and data sharing. We had the PRC2 standard updated with IBR definition and applicability, created PRC28 new standard for IBR disturbance monitoring. Now all of this disturbance monitoring information will be collected and we use for model validation, which is milestone 3 requirement, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The next is looking at IBR write-through criteria. So PRC24 was updated to include type 1 and type 2 wind, and then PRC29 was created specifically for IBR write-through to make sure that it's able to write through any disturbances. And then PRC30 was created to analyze any unexpected IBR excursion. So some of these new standards are specific to IBRs. So having said that, I'll get into milestone 3 summary. So for milestone 3, started this off in terms of 3 projects. The first project was project 2020-06. And there were 2 purposes for this project. The first one was to define the terms model verification and model validation. And the second was to take a look at Mod 26 and Mod 27 NERC standards. So as of this year, project 2020-06 definitions were balloted, and these passed the initial ballot and will be going in for final ballot. So this project defined the terms model verification and model validation, and this will be added to the glossary of terms. The next one is for Mod 26. So Mod 26 has had a few updates. The first one was it took some of the Mod 27 requirements and added that to Mod 26. The second portion was to update the standard for model verification, model validation to include IBRs. And next, we also added some EMT requirements in this. So this was submitted for initial ballot a few weeks back, and we just completed the initial ballot last week. So right now we are in the process of taking a look at all of these comments that we received from the industry and meeting with the drafting team to resolve these comments. Since we're still in the process of looking at these comments, I can sort of give you just a quick update on some of the comments received. I know we got some comments relating to the EMT portion, some of the difficulties or challenges that the entities might face when it comes to that portion of IBRs. The next one was just relating to IBRs, the testing, and some of the questions related to legacy models and how they could do model verification validation on that. So that was a flavor of a lot of the comments we received. And as I said, we're still looking through all of the comments and making sure that we're able to address all these comments. The next project was project 2022-02. This is related to uniform framework for models. And this touched 3 different standards: Mod 32, IRO 10, and TOP 3. The purpose of this project was to make sure that we have consistent data for model validation in accordance with ERO criteria. Additionally, this also defined a new term for distributed energy resource to be used in standards going forward. This project this project went through initial ballot and received comments about a month or so back. So right now, the drafting team is in the process of looking through these comments, resolving some of these comments, some of these issues, and getting ready for our additional ballot sometime in July-August timeframe. So for this, a lot of the comments that we received were in terms of looking at the ERO approved criteria for acceptable models. So this was also submitted as a part of the project 2022-02 initial ballot. And there were a lot of commenters who did not agree about enforceable reliability standards that is reliant on external document. They were also looking at the IRO and the TOP standards, which require entities to reference external information. So that is something that we are working with both the drafting team as well as with our legal and compliance groups. There were also concerns about estimation. They were concerned that the standard might be asking for data that would not be relevant for models if it's not accurate data. There might be ambiguity between regions in terms of the amount of data required. So previously it specified that NERC standards do not specify the how. So a lot of this we leave it up to the planning coordinator or transmission planner to request data that they would need from their entities. So they want to make sure that this isn't ambiguous or this data is consistent. So that's something that we're working towards. And then a big part of this was also looking at unregistered IBRs. So IBRs that are connected more at the distribution level, and seeing how we can make sure that the performance of unregistered IBRs is also captured at the planning coordinator or transmission planner level. So those are some of the issues that we are working on. The third project is project 2021-01, and this specifically updates Mod 33 with requirements for model validation with dynamic event data. So for this particular standard, there were not a lot of updates. The drafting team did try to clarify that. Oh, sorry, I see a comment here that I don't believe the slides are advancing. I'm just speaking to this slide, so hopefully that clarifies the question. All right, so this one is for Mod 33 to update some of the requirements for model validation with dynamic event data. So in particular, they want to clarify that we are comparing the power flow simulation for both steady state and dynamic events to the system behavior and making sure that we're performing model validation. A lot of these comments that we had received during the initial ballot, which ended a few weeks back, was just related to clarifying questions about some of the language that was updated. I believe they had initially removed planning models, but that caused a lot of confusion and ambiguity, and the drafting team is looking into either providing more clarification or adding that term in. The other question was relating to unregistered IBRs. So we did have a footnote in the initial ballot that the standard also will include unregistered IBRs and their performance as seen by the planning coordinators. There were questions around whether we were going to add unregistered IBRs to the glossary of terms. I think right now we don't have any such plans, but we'll definitely reconsider based on industry comments. So we are updating Mod 33 to just state that the Mod 33 model is going to be referring to the model used as part of Mod 32. So since Mod 32 will include unregistered IBRs, we can sort of keep the reference to unregistered IBRs contained within one Mod 32 model, or so one Mod 32 standard, and that will also be applicable to Mod 33. So those are the main comments that we received for Milestone 3, and this is sort of a status update of where we're at with the drafting teams as well as with the industry. I would say that for this standard, all of the drafting team meetings are open to the public and part of the NERC calendar. So we definitely welcome the industry to join as observers and provide their thoughts during the drafting process. Also, we are planning to have a joint webinar as we get into our second ballot for these projects, just to get the industry aware of what are the upcoming changes based on your comments, and seeing if there's any additional comments. Right, so that is the update for Milestone 3. And then going into Milestone 4, the Milestone 4 SARs, we are going to be publishing around the August timeframe. And I did want to touch on this just very briefly because what the Milestone 4 is going to be following Milestone 3. So after model verification validation, we want to go into running the simulations. We'll be publishing call for nominations for Milestone 4 drafting teams and looking for individuals with expertise in planning and operational studies with IBRs. And just to give a flavor of the potential updates that are coming your way in Milestone 4, for operational studies, we are looking to revise some of the definitions that include real-time assessment, operation planning analysis, and balancing contingency event to include IBR performance. We may be looking at revising TOP standards to ensure that IBR performance is captured, and IRO, FAC, and PRC standards to take a look at identifying operating limit exceedances and transmission and generation outages as a part of the update. We're also looking to require reliability coordinators to utilize IBR performance information to determine stability limits. And then for planning studies, the major update for planning studies is going to be for the TPL1 standard. This one, we're looking at creating either a new standard or to updating TPL1 to update planning models. These planning models will include IBRs as required in updated standards from Milestone 3. We'll make sure that we are updating any grid stress performance conditions, as well as planning assessments to capture IBR performance under these conditions. So definitely watch out for these Milestone 4 SARs that will be published around the August timeframe. And And that is the end of my presentation, and I believe we're taking questions towards the end of the meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Sandhya. Right, we'll go straight to the next presentation, and we'll take up all the questions after we're done all three. But I would like to encourage people to use slido.com with event code FIRST2 to post your questions, and we'll get to them after the presentation's been done. And the instructions on Slido are in the chat as well. Miguel, are you there?
Hi, Julia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me share my screen.
Miguel, you're a little bit faint. Maybe you can do something about that.
Give me a second. Michael. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
What's going on? Let me share my app instead.
Yes, now
Can you see my screen?
yeah, it's a PowerPoint kind of mode. If you can go to full screen. Awesome.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for the well, thank you, Julia. The intention of my presentation is to elaborate a little bit on what is the current state of the IBR, specifically on wind, but many of these things are common for both wind and solar in terms of modeling in US. There are not a lot of plots in this. It's just about good practices and different requirements, everything in connection to the new regulation change, IEEE 2800 and 2800.2, and what is in front of us. I will take a couple of seconds in the next slide just to introduce everyone on the intent of this presentation and what is the gap that we are observing from Vestas when we are the supplier of the turbines for different projects in US. And keep in mind, this is related to North America. I will throw also Canada in here just to give you an idea of the good and bad practices we are seeing out there. So what we're seeing out there is that in a lot of parts of US, the generic models are dominating the grid interconnection studies. And they are widely used. And there is a reason why they are widely used. We will talk about that later. But we have the feeling that there is a disconnection between what is observed in those simulation studies and what the reality is. So they give us an illusion of compliance, hiding the real risk of the plant and what potential issues will face that plant during the lifetime, and also make it very, very complicated to commission and sometimes configure that plant to reproduce expected behavior during simulations. And I will just share from Vestas' point of view what we think are the best practices and what we consider from Vestas should be the way of the changes that we need in the industry in order to avoid these potential conflicts and risks. I'll take a second to elaborate on the timeline of a life cycle of a plant. The model that we are using today and the models we use for grid interconnection study is not going to be sitting in a computer and that's it after we get the grid interconnection agreement, grid interconnection permit, and we reach COD. we have to keep in mind that this model will be living in the system for many years, 20, 25 years, and will be used. Today, when we are talking about requirements in IEEE 2800, 2800.2, and not only in US and Canada, but also globally, we don't know what to do. Typically, the question is, but what do we do with these old models that are not capable of meeting the requirements that we are trying to publish today? And that, to some extent, will be inevitable, but we need to think carefully what we want to put in the system today to make sure those plants, those model plants, will be able to survive and will be able to be compliant, or at least have the solid foundations that we can change those models to be compliant later on when new requirements are introduced in the grid. So that's really important to keep in mind. So one thing that I was hesitating yesterday if I should put this slide or not, that is something that we are observing recently, that is an illusion of grid compliance. And of course, with the great help of ChatGPT, I managed to do a great illustration of it that I think that reflects very well what's going on in the system now. We have a lot of requirements in writing about performance of IBR plants, but there is no real definition in the industry. And I know that 2800.2 is doing a great effort to define that, but there is no real definition of how we validate or how we ensure those grid code requirements are actually the expected performance of a plant when we are evaluating for a grid interconnection study. So the first point that gives us this illusion is the use of generic models instead of UDM models. And here I was also hesitating if I should use the word generic models or non-validated models, because I understand for some technologies, maybe the generic model might be a relatively fair representation. But think about generic models as non-validated models compared to the UDM models for the grid interconnection analysis. These models might give you, when you zoom in, an illusion that you have an accurate response, but when you start zooming out and evaluating the whole power system phenomena that could happen in the grid or in that specific plant, they will start deviating. Another thing that we're observing in the industry is disregarding of the OEM provided UDM mods. And this is extremely risky, and it's a practice that I think utilities, ISOs, etc., should stop accepting, because we have seen customers, generator owners, that in order to get interconnection agreements, sometimes not only use generic models, but they might use even different OEM models to get these grid interconnection agreements. And then when the plan is, from a business point of view, when the deal is closed and this plant goes into the actual construction and commissioning, we will face significant challenge trying to match the performance of OEM A with OEM B. So in some occasions, trying to take shortcuts, we just, or some generator owners might use wrong models, even though they have access to the UDM models. Another thing is that the fake or the illusion of having an EMT model sometimes is not sufficient to have an accurate representation of what's going on in the plant. And this is really important to keep in mind, because EMT models or UDM models are not necessarily a synonym of an accurate model, right? The model needs to go through a thorough validation process to make sure could be considered an accurate model to represent the product. And then something that is really, really concerning as well, and I will be talking a little bit more about that in the next slide, is the disconnection between the model setup and the actual plant configuration. Sometimes, even when we have the best practices in the world, and we do the grid interconnection analysis with detailed model, UDMs, and following all the best practices, we must ensure that we have processes in place that captures any deviation from the actual model configuration and the plant configuration. And just as a personal experience. When I, before moving to US, I was working in 2018 on a project that it was very complicated to get a stable operation in the model. And in 2018, we spent hours globally from Denmark. And then after moving here 5 years after, I realized we use user-defined models, everything looking great in the simulation model, but those configurations, those settings never ended up in the product. So that plan was operating without the parameterization of that study. So it's not only required that we follow the right process in terms of model and best practices, but also we ensure, and this is something that, for example, I think is captured very well in NERC, we ensure that parameter verification reports are in place. So we validate that whatever was used in the models is actually in the product. And then something that there is a lot of work and effort, especially from NERC, is capturing the oversimplified system representations. Is not only the generation unit from the OEM that requires, or that will give you accuracy when we are analyzing the grid interconnection potential risks. Is also the surrounding representation, right? Having the right BOP, ensuring that the protections are in place, ensuring that the control loops that are necessary are present in those simulation models, etc. So, in short, having these points in mind, or following these points in this slide, might give you the illusion that you have a grid compliant product when you don't really have one. So they might produce very clean results, pretty results on paper or on the computer, but they don't reflect the reality of how that IBR plan will work. And some might say, well, but we have the commissioning phase when we are aiming to validate that the plant resembles or is grid compliant. But in today's process, the commissioning phase of an IBR plan in US, in most of the US, is extremely simplified. And there are a couple of voltage and frequency steps that doesn't prove much when we are commissioning a plant with the mod testing, and that doesn't ensure that plant will perform as it was expected during the simulation models. And actually, I don't have them with me, but I think NERC has very interesting numbers in how the deviation from the actual study submitted compared to the performance when there are major disturbances in the grid. So, in order to achieve grid compliance, what I have put two paths in here. That is the easy way and the right way. Of course, this is my opinion about it, but I think the IEEE is doing a great process. Is doing capturing a lot of these ideas to make sure they will become requirements in different regions. Use the correct model. We cannot rely on generic or not validated models. We need to use user-defined models that replicate the actual control logic, dynamic, and philosophy of the control of both the IBR unit and also the power plant controller. If we use those generic models, yeah, we might have very result that might look compliant, but that will give us a false sense of security. While using the right models, yeah, sometimes we will uncover major problems, we will face issues, but we are not hiding those. So we need to deal with them early enough before the plant goes into operation. It's very complicated, very time-consuming, and very expensive to find a grid compliant issue with a plant that is already operating. Because when that plant is operating and is curtailed by the ISO, this will be a loss of production that will be claimed on the OEM or on the generator owner because the plant was not performing as expected. So it's better to capture the wrong or incorrect or undesired behavior early enough and not when the plant is in operation. No correlation between the simulation and the product configuration. I have mentioned this quickly before. It's important that it doesn't end up in the simulation model that we submit, that this actual configuration is dumped and is translated into the product. And following the easy way, of course, will require sometimes to do manual tuning, patches, and yeah, in order to pass the commissioning. Just zooming in a lot in the couple of tests that we're doing the mock testing, but that doesn't mean that that plant will actually represent the exact same performance when we are facing LVRTs, HVRTs, or any other kind of disturbances in the grid. So what we think, Julia, there is a lot of silence. I don't know if it's my computer. I hope you are still there.
Yes, we're still here.
Okay. Yeah, so it's
questions coming on Slido, so people can hear you too. So.
Okay, great. So what we think from Vestas is more effective and less effective in terms of requirements surrounding the models. We consider very effective some of the practices introduced in some regions in US, like the parameter verification reports and ensure models and products are aligned. And there is a traceability of all the changes that the product will suffer during the lifetime, and we will always have a corresponding model that reflects those changes. Model quality test, I have put this name that is used in ERCOT, but you can call it anyway. I know in Nova Scotia they use a different name, Hydro-Quebec uses a different name, but basically certain procedure that aims to prove the robustness of the models. This is really, really important because it's not only that the model have specific performance in terms of the actual product, but also the model is robust enough under certain conditions that sometimes are not even evaluated during the grid interconnection process. And verification and validation. I know the IEEE 2800.2 is doing a great effort in this, but I'm a bit disconnected from the latest meetings, but I understand that it will be a more qualitative approach instead of quantitative approach. And having a non-verified or non-validated model might be risky if we are talking about huge gaps in terms of tolerance between measurements and models. We might end up running simulations with a user-defined model that give us a false sense of, or the false impression that we have accurate results when they are really not, because the model have not been validated for this specific condition. So it's very important to understand what can we use a model for, because EMT model user-defined is a great tool, is the way forward in our opinion, but it's not the solution for everything, right? And we have explained in other forums why certain requirements cannot be demonstrated even with the most accurate user-defined source code integrated EMT, because simply you cannot capture certain phenomena in that simulation realm. And then what we think is a bit less effective in terms of demonstrate grid compliance or making sure we have a reliable IBR models are OEM attestations, because this is just a piece of document that might be a legal evidence that an OEM have said something, but is actually the opposite. I understand from a legal point of view might be required in some occasions, depending on the context of the attestation, but this doesn't give us really any evidence that the model is really accurate. It's just a piece of legal evidence paper that could be used later on in litigation, but it doesn't have the reliability of the system, really. Model compliance checklist, I think this is good guidance sometimes, but having a yes and no in a very long document of 5 pages is not necessarily, again, evidence that the model can do that. It's just that someone put an X mark on those, in that checklist of those criteria, but this needs to be proven by simulations. So a very recurrent example that I get is that, is this model capable of producing the same results within certain time steps? And we can mark yes and no. But actually, in some other regions, we have certain cases that we have to run at 1, 5, 10, and 20 microseconds and make sure all the results are overlapping. So one thing is to put a tick mark saying that you can do that, and another thing is to actually validate it through simulation model, because again, even with the best practices, there will be always bugs, there will be always issues in the model, and there must be a process that captures those deficiencies. And then generic RFIs, I understand that sometimes these are required when there are large disturbances in the grid, and we have to collect information about the performance of the plants, but it's not really very effective. And we can see, especially after the exercise of NOVA 245, that the level of scrutiny and detail from all generator owners is definitely not the same. Some of them might take this very seriously and go to the very bottom of it, but some might take it a bit lightly. So it is okay. It's similar as the OEM attestation. It's good to have there, but it doesn't really improve the reliability of the system. I might do it with time, Julia. How much time left do I have?
Up to 5 minutes.
Up to 5 minutes. Good. So some of the model validation variances that we have defined in Vestas internally, and again, these I think are being discussed as well in the 2800.2. I'm not going in details through all of them because it will take too much time. But the importance about this is that a model can be validated in many different ways, right? We can model validate versus hardware in the loop or software in the loop. They're actually representation of that device in a simplified environment. We can also validate against real contingencies or field tests. There is the actual full product, including all the way from, I don't know, from the foundations to the blades, and evaluate some of the phenomena. And then we can do more digital simulation that is multi-model validation. Each of them or all of them will be required if we really want to ensure that we have a grid compliant product. We cannot take shortcuts in here. I understand that some of these model validation will be more expensive than others, but we have presented in different forums why some of the new requirements and sometimes cannot really be validated if it's not with an actual model versus field test, because no model, even the most accurate model that you can produce in PSCAD, will give us sometimes an accurate results. And examples like this are many. I mean, when we're talking about something that is not a requirement today in US, but when we're talking about power oscillation damping, for example, that's something that will require a very detailed mechanical representation model that typically is missing even in the most accurate EMT model. So that's something you cannot really assess in accurately. Sometimes in EMT domain, we have talked about in the past about rock-off, how rock-off, that is an electrical event, actually triggers protections of auxiliary systems that are not typically present in an EMT model. So we need, as an industry, we need to do the Plinko exercise and define which kind of requirements will be validated in which way. And that's really important going forward to have clarity of what we need to do to validate models. Just to wrap it up, I don't want to go over time like the last time I was presenting in this forum. So conclusions and recommendations from Vestas, from our point of view, we should follow a model development process that is a source code integration. You can call it digital twin, you can call it whatever you want, but we need to integrate the source code from the real product into the simulation models if we want the real performance. This is the only way that we can have a mirror parameterization. So whatever studies we do in the simulations, in the computers, can be translated into the product. We cannot use a model that has a set of parameters in one alphabet and the product has a set of parameters in another alphabet, because there is no direct translation. And if the industry standardization is required, that eventually will be, as the technology matures, we should put our effort in standardize the interface towards the power system commercial tools, call it PSC, TSAT, PSCAD, whatever the tool is, so OEMs can still supply their user-defined code, but the standard is the interface and the interaction between the power simulation tool and the code is standardized. So most of the problems are typically solved by using generic models like simplicity, that is basically the main one. We can address those by the standardization of this interface or wrappers, and there are a couple of secret groups working towards that. So in short, before that standardization takes place in the industry and that is more mature, the conclusion from Vestas will be that if we want to avoid expensive issues after the commercial operation date on a plant, let's do the right well, let's follow the right way, use the right models, and that's the only way that we can de-risk their projects before it's too late. And that will be it, Julia.
Thank you so much, Miguel. And again, just a reminder to put your questions in Slido, slido.com, event code first2. And with that, let's go ahead and switch to Andrew to talk about legacy models. And again, the reason why we talk about that is that once the NERC standards are updated and approved, they will apply across the boards to all IBRs unless there are exclusions.
All right, Julia, can you hear me? And see my
Yes,
screen?
and we can see your screen too.
Okay, great. And if I get behind on the slides, then please let me know, because sometimes I'm a little disconnected here. So thank you. My name is Andrew Isaacs. I work for a company called Electranix based in Winnipeg in Canada. We're consultants focusing on studies and simulation. I've been here for a little over 20 years. I'm a technical lead and a VP. So I want to thank the previous presenters. And I feel like especially Miguel's presentation is a song that so many of us have heard before over the last, 5 or 10 years. And it's such a good message. I feel like we need to listen to that one on repeat. What Miguel is saying, I think that presentation is, is very, very harsh and tough. It's basically saying there's a high bar for modeling, but it's also hopeful because, we have the technology now, we have the ability, we have very good standards coming out. 2800.2. I think actually today is the balloting deadline. If you haven't looked at that standard, this is it's very detailed, has a ton of discussion around all of these topics, and there's other resources out there as well. And I guess now we're going to listen to another tune that you've heard before from me. Certainly, you can see this as a rehash of a more than a year old presentation, but honestly, we've been talking about this for probably at least 5 years and more like 10 as well. And this isn't a tune that I like at all. This one, Julia says, can you please talk about legacy plant modeling? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about that because it's not a presentation anybody likes, because it's basically an unhappy story. There's often no good or satisfactory solution to this problem. And so this presentation won't make anybody happy, and I don't really like giving it. So let's start with that. And the reason is this question is, what do we do about old models or old plants that aren't where we want them to be, is exactly why it's very important to ask for good quality models prior to interconnection, whether or not you will use them immediately in the study. So there's still lots of plants connecting and no model being brought in at that time. And if it is a model that's brought in because there's a requirement out there, nobody's checking it. And so it ends up being, whatever, quality issues exist, basically start to get embedded in that model. So we need very, sufficiently detailed and specific requirements. It's very important. You have to ask the right questions, test and review the models that are submitted thoroughly. All of the points that Miguel made are exactly on point. I can endorse all of them. And stay tuned for, I think, future i2X presentations. The next few, I think we'll be talking about some of the details about how to do this. But going back to, that's sort of we're at the point now where we're doing a presentation about water under the bridge. Basically, this has not happened. What are we going to do? And by the way, this is starting to be, or continuing to be a critical problem in many regions who are now being dragged into, certain compliance issues with model requirements, starting to want to perform PSCAD studies as they, penetration gets higher in their particular area. And by the way, will start to be a problem with data centers very soon, and in some cases already. So all of these lessons that we're learning for IBRs right now, this is what we're talking about today, are going to happen again for data centers. Okay, so this is something that we're not talking about today, but in the back of your mind, you can already be thinking about that, okay? Because this is, again, going to be water under the bridge. So if you're missing a PSCAD, oh, sorry, I use PSCAD. I shouldn't use PSCAD. I'm going to change this. And, oh, shoot, I wasn't advancing my slides. This is why I'm going to just stop sharing that way. And I'm going to go to this mode so I don't do that anymore. So these slides will be available afterwards. So we're gonna talk about now, I'm going to say EMT model. So this is not specific to PSCAD. This is all EMT models. And we're focusing a little bit on EMT right now, but keep in mind that these principles generally apply also to phasor domain models. So when you need to get a model and you don't have one, okay, the model, maybe the plant exists already in the system. Now, as Miguel said, this is going to be a heavy lift for you. So you need to decide now what exactly do you need the model for? Are you trying to collect models, which isn't a terrible idea? Or is there a study? And if there is a study, what is the importance of that particular plant in the study? Is it the main event? Is it the one that you're trying to study, or is it kind of peripheral to the main event that you're studying? And what exactly are you interested in as an outcome of the study? So are you next to a series capacitor and you're interested in damping, like a subsynchronous control interaction study? Are you generally interested in fault ride through or voltage control, or are you doing a transient study like an energization study or a switching study of some kind? And is the plant relatively large or relatively small? In other words, is this going to have massive consequences if there's bad behavior, or relatively minor consequences? And depending on the answer to these questions, you may have to dedicate different amounts of effort to this collection of the model, okay? If you don't have a model and you can't apply all of the existing rules for model quality and force the issue, maybe through regulation, or if for some reason it's, even if you wanted to force the issue, there is no reasonable path, okay? So the GO just has no options. Maybe the inverter manufacturer is out of business. Maybe there's no time, maybe that, you have all the other sorts of problems. We do have some options, but I have some big red bold things here. One is to remember that anything outside of a fully qualified PSCAD, whenever I say PSCAD, please say PSCAD or let's say EMTP. I'll just say EMT here. Get myself in trouble here. EMT. Anything outside of a fully qualified model will degrade the benefit that you're obtaining. Now, maybe it's okay, again, depending on the type of study you're doing, but those requirements on accuracy are there for a reason. And if you degrade that model quality too far, and the plant is important, you are essentially wasting your time. There's no benefit from doing that EMT study. You're basically saying, we're just going to put a guess in, and then we're going to get a result and try and make a decision based on a guess. So, I will say that this is what our shop does full time. We do EMT studies, and it's routine that we run into a region where we don't have a good enough EMT model. And in those cases, we're going to have to do something as a proxy. But if we're, as consultants, sometimes we're pushed further than we're comfortable, and someone says, go ahead and do the study. Here's a generic model. We just want to see what it shows. And we can say, okay, we'll show you what it shows. But nobody likes to waste their time. I've got, highly trained engineers who know that any study that they produce or any result they produce is going to be essentially a guess and unactionable. And so they're going to spend the next, month working on a study that is going to essentially have no meaning. It's very demoralizing. So please spare my engineers. I'm going to give you just an example of that. So if you have an SSCI study, okay, this is something that you might encounter in a region with a lot of series capacitors, maybe California or Pacific Core system or an ERCOT system and many others. You would have to quantify the overall damping that you see in the subsynchronous frequency range. And we can do that with I can draw something here. We do a frequency scan of the impedance versus frequency here, and we have 60 hertz, and we have impedance, and we would maybe see something that looked like, or we would actually, not the impedance, we would look at resistance, for example, in a very simple way. There's more complicated ways to do this scanning, but we would be looking for regions where in the subsynchronous frequency range, we would see negative resistance, which would indicate that this plant might have negative damping at any frequency, let's say above 30 hertz, okay? Now, we would compare this damping characteristic with the damping of the existing transmission system and all of the other renewable plants. We would add up all the damping and decide whether the system is going to be stable or not, and whether this plant is stable on its own or not. So that will basically determine whether or not the system is going to be stable, whether there's going to be damage to the series capacitors or to the plants. And this is a very, anybody who's on this call who's ever connected a plant in ERCOT will be very familiar with all of this. So if you were to say, what if the plant, rather than the frequency scan looking like that, looked like this? Okay, so now it's crossing at maybe 35 hertz. Okay, this can be, the matter of 3 to 5 hertz in an SSCI study in Texas can be extremely important. It can be the difference between a successful project and an unsuccessful project, okay? And this difference in frequency scan can be the difference in a control parameter in a highly accurate model. So if you take one of, Miguel's beautiful models, parameterized, coming straight from the, the source code, and there's a small change in the parameters in the model. So this is the same turbine, same hardware, but they've parameterized it slightly different or tuned one of their controllers slightly different. It can shift this damping characteristic over by enough to pass or fail the plant. And I promise you, there have been projects that have languished for more than a year in these study processes trying to get this frequency moved over by a few hertz. Okay, so this is very important. And so if you get it wrong, you essentially will have important consequences leading to curtailment or new rules, or rules like you shall not ever connect to a series compensated line because we essentially don't believe that you're going to get your modeling right. Okay, so and that's sort of a thing that might happen in some parts of the world. Okay, so considering that, if you don't have a model, the correct model approach is to get a model that meets all the requirements from the GO. Next best is to find the engineers involved from the original OEM, let's say the OEM's out of business, and ask or pay them to create a model using their best information. And this can be done, has been done. It's expensive and takes a long time, okay? And you'll have varying degrees of success. You can move to a proxy model, and this is what Miguel is basically saying don't do. And I'm not really disagreeing with him, but we're going from best to worst here. So you can learn what you can about the equipment and configure a proxy model using a similar vintage and type of model from the same OEM. Okay, and keeping in mind this bottom red point, if the device is very important to the study, proxy modeling is not recommended, and you may consider saving your time by not doing an EMT study at all. Option number 4, if you can test the hardware in a lab, you may be able to configure a detailed generic model to match the performance. Option 5, learn what you can about the equipment and configure a proxy model using a similar vintage and type of model from a different OEM. Now, we're getting to some pretty gnarly territory, and at this point, you know, Miguel's probably tapped out and he says, no, all of these options are bad, don't do any of this. I will say, though, that there are some types of studies where this may be okay, all right? If the type of thing you're looking for is, you know, not critically dependent on those things, or if this plant is very small, or if this plant is not really central to what you're doing, this might be a reasonable approach. And also keep in mind, sometimes you're genuinely over a barrel. You need to do the best you can, and there's nothing else that can be done. Okay, you've exhausted all the other opportunities, and this is where you end up. But a reminder that deviations from the accurate implementation of phase lock loops, protection circuits, intercontrols, all of that stuff that we ask for in our accuracy guidelines, basically will be misrepresented, and you'll get either a false positive or a false negative on the study. Continuing towards the worst, you can take the generic model approach, learn what you can about the equipment and configure a generic model to match key settings. And number 7 would be using a generic model. And again, the red text, if the device is important to the study, generic modeling is not recommended, and you should basically save your time by not doing a study. Okay, so I want to, you know, you've heard all of that before. I'm going to just finish with a couple of practical tips here and some extra thoughts on this topic. One is that models are going to continue to require maintenance and updating over time. And what we're seeing is that, you know, utilities charged with tracking and keeping these models are going to need to improve their data organization procedures so that changes can be tracked, so that versions can be tracked, as-builts, parameters, all of those things can be tracked, and that needs to be trued up against event data over time. And this is not necessarily trivial. There's a lot of data to handle, and it needs to be organized correctly. As the requirements change, also old models might become non-compliant, and so that's why it's very important to be very thoughtful and careful with the requirements that you start with. Also very important to check them, right? Because it's easy to make a requirement and not enforce it. Miguel referred to the SIGRE work that was done as a brochure that was released last year. Guidelines for use of real code and EMT models. This will be, I think there's a PAR for, I forget the number of it, but it's now going to be a standard in IEEE as well, or at least there's a PAR been released for a standard. And models should be written to support these techniques. This not only helps with accuracy, so this allows you to take you know, the actual code of the model. It not only helps you with the accuracy of the model, but it helps with maintainability down the road. It will allow compatibility between versions of EMT tools, for example, and phaser domain tools as well. And these can be built into your requirements. Some more practical tips. Updating existing models can be just as hard as getting a model that never existed, okay? Because once the project is in and the developer is sort of moved on, or the OEMs have moved on, it's very difficult to come back. you can consider using an old model as a type of proxy model for the plant, but all of those same caveats go along with that. I wanted to, since we're talking about, you know, the NERC process here and building on the first presentation, of validation is very important, and we're all, you know, validation is relatively new actually for certain types of models, and then the 2800.2 standard spent a lot of effort trying to nail this down, and there's a lot more to be said about it. But I wanted to say that it's not actually sufficient. You know, don't think of validation as being the end all of accurate models. Okay, we have a lot of guidance on how to do unit level validation. You can do very good validation. It's very important. It will help. And you can do validation of plants after event data, but neither of those things are sufficient to get you a good enough model. A good quality plant model actually requires care in how it's created. So those things, you know, those ideas of real code techniques, you can't catch everything in a validation. It's very difficult to be complete enough to be perfect, okay? And so correct implementation into a plant, site-specific parameterization, all of those things are very important and might not be caught, especially by unit level validation. And plant level validation is also insufficient because it's very difficult to get conditions correct enough in your models to represent the system condition that was you know, where the event occurred, and the event is not comprehensive either. It's a single fault maybe that goes to a certain voltage depth and a certain, you know, system strength and all of that. So we don't have a way to thoroughly test the model at the plant level either. So yeah, and as Miguel said, the standard of validation is also varying by OEM and by regional requirements. So there's no good agreement on how good does the validation have to be. So what I'm saying is that validation isn't perfect. It is useful, but we may not be able to capture all the critical elements of performance. And so you need to go back to also all of the other model requirements, documentation checks, all of those things that are coming in. And again, I would refer you to 2800.2, which it has extremely sort of comprehensive guides for how to do all of those types of verifications. I'll summarize by saying nobody likes wasting time or money. No one likes wrong models leading to costly or even sad consequences, right? We don't want to have, I liked Miguel's idea of a beautiful model that, you know, is just wrong. It's not going to help us. Remember, it's very difficult to model legacy models correctly after the fact. Make good modeling and validation requirements. Check your models carefully. That's a very important part of a requirement is enforcement. At interconnection time before you need them, right? You need to do that first. And then continuing over time, we need to ensure that the as-builts match the studies and models and continue to validate them over time. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too harsh. Thank you all for listening. Appreciate the opportunity to chat, and I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks to all presenters. As I mentioned, please use Slido if you have any additional questions. You can also raise your hand now if you have any additional questions that you haven't posted in Slido. We'll take Slido questions first, and then we'll move on to the structured discussion as well. But some of the questions kind of along the lines of structured discussion, so we'll spend time on the Slido questions first.